public sphere and make it acceptable, make it part of the law, which is then enforceable and so on. So what Biden says is, you know, this is my private thing, and I confess that, but I don't want to impose it on anybody. So he does not want to enter it into the legislative process so that it becomes an enforceable law, because moral laws cannot be enforced. They can be enforced only if they're transformed into positive law, if they are posited by Congress or, you know, by a state legislature or whatever. So, but these are good examples now. They become very tricky there, you know, in what the Democratic Party says and the other party says and so on. And so the religious people have to, Biden did not think that he could make an argument which the majority of Americans would understand any longer. And the reason is, you know, the American public has no natural law. The Stoic natural law of the Catholic Church has been abandoned. We do not even have the bourgeois natural law anymore, which through the French Revolution was transformed. We have a purely positivistic administration of justice. That means only those laws which are made by the states or by the federation are binding. Everything else is private morality. So you still can introduce, you know, the thing against abortion and so on, but you have to make this clear now, you know, so that it is plausible to people who do not believe any longer. And it's not only belief, it's the whole culture has changed. That means we do not understand Aristotle anymore. We do not understand Plato anymore, because we are not Platonists, not Aristotelians, we are nominalists. See, the concepts are not real for us. They are only forms in our head by which we order things outside. So if somebody acts as if human nature, you know, was something real and not something in our head, the majority in the public sphere will not understand that anymore. That's what I mean with culture, you know, where our culture is. It is Protestant, it is nominalistic, it is pragmatic. And all these characteristics of our culture are in every citizen somehow. Even in those who are still belong to the subcultures, like Baptists, Catholics, and so on. These subcultures have been moved out of the state into the private sphere. You can, in the private sphere, you can do, you know, if you don't attack the public law, you can do all kinds of things in there. The Muslims, 1 million in Detroit, you know, they can talk about the Sharia law at home, but if they want to take part of the Sharia law and make it into American law, they have to go through this process, you know. If they want to say honor death or so on, they would like to introduce that in American culture, they would have to make clear to the people in the public sphere why honor death, what the purpose of it is, and who has. If they would simply say Allah wants this, it would not be enough, because the secular sphere is secular. I mean, the public sphere is secular.
It's what Habermas calls the publicly accessible reasoning.
Right.
That everyone can reason with it.
Yeah, right. So, and this is not very easy, you know, in some of those issues which those religious people have. How do you take, for instance, the usury law? If you want to a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, and you want to reintroduce the usury law again, even in the mild form of Catholics, let's take all interest rates down to 2.1% or whatever. You know, how do you make that clear to people in order to make it plausible and acceptable? That is the art. You know, that is why Paul comes in the Arab Park, and by saying those nice things there, he tries to make it plausible and acceptable. They have laughed, and he has to stop them laughing and saying, "You are a parrot," or whatever, you know. Or hear the doctors saying, you know, they think, there are these bishops who think that God puts souls, you know, into those little embryos in 10 million women every year. You know, this sounds ridiculous, you know. So, or when the bishops then say, you know, you naturalists, you take the last little morality out of our youth, which they still have. So then it becomes hostile, and it doesn't lead anywhere, and then it's simply power. The secular world, the sciences, the state, they are more powerful. And the religious people will just be pushed to the private sphere, and there they can do whatever they want to. And I mean, it would be part, if the secularization goes on, they will simply push the religious groups, they will not persecute them or whatever, but they push them, place or whatever. So the 47% of Omni come to mind. So that would not be the ideal democracy. So nevertheless, here he talks to them now. Men of Athens, I have seen for myself how extremely scrupulous you are in all religious matters. Now we heard before that he almost vomited when he came into Athens. Because for him as a believing Jew, these were all idols, these beautiful goddesses and gods, ideal men and women in sculptures. They stood all outside of the temple. They were not in the temple. They stood outside in front of the door. And so he could see them. And they were not clothed. They were naked. So the Greek's faith came from seeing. The Jewish faith and the Christian faith comes from hearing, through the ear. And so he had not the right organ for seeing what was going on. But they were all idols for him, and he was vomiting, and now he says something nice. He says, extremely scrupulous you are in all religious matters. So this is called the captatio benevolentiae. You start out a talk by making a nice compliment to your audience in order to put them into a good mood. You will not say something nasty. So we had a teacher who came to the class and says, you are all stupid. So that is a bad thing to start out with. So therefore, and if it is entirely honest, that's another question. So the main thing is to get him on his side. Because I noticed, as I strolled around admiring your sacred monuments, he vomited. He didn't admire them at all. So Paul is a very complicated type of a guy, and we mentioned a few incidences before. He was, when he had converted, he was dragged before the Synhedrion, which was a secular religious government of the state of Israel, before it was destroyed in the year 70, and then in the year 134 under the Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba was a Messiah, like Jesus is called a Messiah, so he was called the Messiah. Even the greatest rabbi of that time, the Rabbi Akiba, told the Jews that this was the Messiah who had come to redeem the Jewish people. And then he was beaten by the Roman army, and they committed suicide. Hundreds of Jews committed suicide, and that was the real end of the state of Israel at that time. So nevertheless, that is in the background. And so he has dragged before the Synhedrion. That was before the year 70, of course, because after the year 70, when the Roman troops came through Lebanon and encircled the whole thing, and they also took the temple, and there something happened which the Romans did not want to happen. The Romans honored the gods of all the people. So when they went to Germania, to Gallia, to Britannia, they would take half of the gods home and would put them into the Pantheon. Pantheon, that means all gods. And the Pantheon is still there. The building is still there. And then they put them there, and the priests would put holy smoke and everything and would sacrifice to them. Because the Romans had a religion of utility, as this is called. That means they utilized the gods so that they would protect the state. And so they wanted to make sure that all gods in the empire were helping the Roman Empire to be victorious and so on. And the problem with the Jews and the Christians was that they did not sacrifice. And when they did not sacrifice, then the gods got angry, and then they would be against the empire. And then the empire would have inflation and depressions and defeat and war. And so they blamed the Jews and then the Christians that they were responsible, that means for these defeats, because they said, first of all, it's atheism. You do not sacrifice to the gods, so the Christians were atheists. And when you were atheists, you also committed high treason. That means you did an act against the state. not to recognize the gods meant then that the gods did not help Roman Empire. And St. Augustine still, who is the founder of the Roman Catholic paradigm, he still wrote, these books in order to defend Christians against this charge by saying the Roman Empire lost battles before there were any Christians. So don't blame them. You had, inflations and depressions and all that before when there were no Christians yet, and therefore the Christians are not responsible. As a matter of fact, the Christians pray for the emperor and for the state and so on and so on. That was so Christianity adjusted slowly to the Roman Empire. So nevertheless, before the Synhedrion then, the state was occupied. The high priest and all that, the kings in Galilee and Judea, they were all appointed by Rome, and they were dependent on Rome. Then what Paul did there, in order to show his, not scrupulous, but his smartness or his cunning. He was a cunning type of a guy. Cunning, he said to them, they were all sitting there, and they charged him he was not allowed to preach Jesus the Christ, because the Christian sect was, and Christianity was a Jewish sect, and they prayed at home, but then they went, hi, nice to see you. They went to the temple like all the other Jews, and then they went home and they broke the bread, and they had a communistic community. They sold all the houses and the land and gave it to Peter, and then Jesus' brother Jacob took the position, and then they distributed to everybody. That means from everybody according to his ability to everybody according to his need. And we said that during the two conventions that both parties quoted that, but they forgot, first of all, that it was from the New Testament. Secondly, that Marx had made it into the basis of his communistic teaching of his historical materialism. But also the president had used it when he defended his progressive taxation. That means those who are more able to pay should pay more, so that the needs of the others, schools, education, and so on, could be paid for. Okay, but what happened now, the Synhedrion was dissolved then, and it was before the year 100 already, but the Romans allowed part of the Synhedrion to move to the city of Joppe, which is at the Mediterranean. And so the Synhedrion went on after 70, and it happened then around 100 that the Christians were excommunicated from the Jewish community. And the reason was Jesus of Nazareth. So Christianity is not a religion of the book. Judaism is a religion of the book, and Islam is a religion of the book. And Dustin knows that Islamic people very often call, the Christians a religion of the book and so on. But Christians understand themselves as a religion concentrated on this man, Jesus of Nazareth. The books are written by the church. They are written about this man, Jesus. So the whole thing is Jesus-centered. But that was before all of this. It was when the Synhedrion was still in Jerusalem, and they forbid the Christian sect. They didn't excommunicate them yet, but they forbid them to announce that Jesus had been resurrected and went up to heaven, and he preached it anyway. Paul went around everywhere, and Peter too. So they put him before the Synhedrion, and he then said, "It is because of the resurrection that I'm standing here." And he knew that the Pharisee believed it. The resurrection of the flesh is an idea which the Pharisees developed about 100 years, 200 years before Jesus, when they were attacked by Greek armies and had huge casualties. And so the question was, where do all these dead people go? Before that, there was something like an underworld, which were neither good nor bad people. It was a shadowy world where nobody wanted to go, and so on. But now it becomes a little bit different. For Jesus, he talks about the Gehenna, and the Gehenna was a garbage place south of Jerusalem, which was burning all the time. They burned the garbage there. So but it was also a valley in Palestine where the old religions had sacrificed children to the god. So both of them were images for a cursed place. So nevertheless, the Pharisees then got this idea that the fallen people, that they would not only their souls would go up to heaven, but it could be the resurrection of the body. And this is what the Christian sect took over. So that Paul said, if the Pharisaic belief of the resurrection of the dead is not true, then Jesus has not been resurrected. And if Jesus has not been resurrected, then we are the poorest devil in this world, because we get nothing out of this world and there is no other. So that was Paul's realistic assessment, and now he uses that, and he knows the Pharisees believe it because they had invented it, and the Sadducees, who were enlightened people, they participate in the Hellenistic Enlightenment. Like we, when I have my students before them, the Saudis have no bourgeois enlightenment, they have no Marxist enlightenment, they have no Freudian enlightenment. The students from Michigan have a bourgeois enlightenment, but they have no Marxist enlightenment, that was repressed, and they have only half a Freudian enlightenment because it was half repressed. So these Sadducees, that was the priests, the high priest and so on. Most of the Sanhedrin, or half of them, the others were all Sadducees, and therefore there were discussions. When Jesus discusses with the Sadducees about eternal life, they challenged that he believed in that, because Jesus was closer to the Pharisees than he was to the Sadducees. So by saying this now, he knew that the two would get at each other's beards, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and so they did. And they shouted at each other, and he was sitting there and enjoyed the whole theater. They forgot completely everything about him and just discussed the resurrection now. And after that was finished, he did even worse against them. He said, I'm not accepting your trial. I'm not accepting your jurisprudence. And he appealed to the emperor. That means he appealed to the occupation force. And then the Romans paid his trip through the Mediterranean, took 2 years to Rome, and then he was in prison in Rome, but a very loose type of a prison. So he had visitors, he had people who served him in prison and so on, so it was not very strict. And then there must have been a trial, but that is not history. And Peter also had a trial. He was executed, so the tradition goes, but he was a Roman citizen, so he could not be crucified. But Peter was crucified, but he didn't want to be crucified upright, so they crucified him upside down, because Peter thought that was Jesus, and he was not Jesus, so he wanted to be crucified the other way around. So that is the tradition, and we don't have to go any further, but just in order to characterize the man who is now standing there. So he has already years where he goes from synagogue to synagogue in order to convince the Jews first, and that we cannot call the public sphere yet. But now in Athens, he goes really to the marketplace. He did in Ephesus too, in other places too. And but he's now in the center of the Greek world for his discourse. And so, so the monuments we see, this is not dishonest, that is rhetoric. Rhetoric is an art. It is something which can be studied, and he has this rhetoric knowledge and skills, and so he starts with this captatio benevolence. He goes down before them in order to show his goodwill, in order to get them on his side, and he says some things which he is not entirely convinced of, namely about these monuments there. That you had an altar inscribed to an unknown God. So when he came through the door, there was this altar. Well, he says, the God whom I proclaim is in fact the one whom you already worship without knowing it. So there is something, when you enter the public sphere, you have to build bridges to the other people, to the non-believers, to different parties, and so on. And that is the way how he does it. He says, what I want to bring, you have it already. So in order to have a playing field for his discourse, which he wants to open up. And so we can say that we can learn from this if we have a discussion on rape, for instance. You know that there are wild definitions by the FBI and by different people about this rape thing, forcible rape and so on, forcible rape and so on. When you have a discussion, then you want to build a bridge to the other people, or we had stem cell research where you said, we all want to heal Alzheimer's, and we all say that the embryo is human. We just have that little difference, the embryo is not yet a person, and so on. So that is a good model, and that's what we want to look for. If we look to Bonhoeffer or Paul or Augustine, these can be models for a Christian or believer to enter the public sphere, which is unbelieving. And for us, what is particularly difficult, that the public sphere is full of people who have lost it. That means they have been Christians, During my birthday party, there was a wonderful colleague of mine. We founded the union, the university union there, and he came downtown recently, and he said to somebody, if all the Catholics were like Rudi Siebert, then I would not have left the church. And the other one said, if all were like Rudi Siebert, I would have left the church a long time ago. So public opinion is somewhat divided there in Kalamazoo. But nevertheless, I think the thing which Paul didn't have and which Augustine didn't have is that most of our audience are people who have left the church. So we have masses of people in Europe who leave. We have masses here. A few years ago, we were 2/3 of the American population. We are only 1/4 now. And we are still 1/4 because 12 million Catholics came from South America, Latin America, and so on. And therefore, that has filled up the rows, but otherwise it would even be more. So, and these people, that is, what one has to deal with. So they are not people from other religions, some there, of course, and believers, but there are those who have been believers and had some reason to give it up, whatever that reason may have been, birth control or authoritarian regime or dogmatism in the church or whatever. There are innumerable reasons why, and one has to talk about that very differently. And the Pope has just written an encyclical, Porta Fidei, which was read on Sunday in all the churches around the world, in which he recognizes this, though the evangelization is his theme, and there is a whole rubric of re-evangelizing people who have lost it, and the number of them becomes larger and larger all the time. Okay, so now he starts out. So he has built that bridge. Now he starts out and says, since the God who made the world and everything in it is himself Lord of heaven and earth, he does not make his home in shrines made by human hands. Now here comes the criticism. Now, see, he has said these things in order to make them feel good, but now he starts the criticism. So that is also to be learned. You cannot start out with criticism. You have to see, first of all, what we have in common before you say what we have not in common. Suddenly he comes out, and this is this unbelievably dialectical mind of that Jew. And the Jewish dialectic is much sharper even than the Greek dialectics. So now he says suddenly, that this God whom he brings there and who sits already on the altar out there, that he does not need any shrines. That means he suddenly denies all the temples there. One could say, of course, that the gods were outside of the temples, but that would be a little bit sophistry. So sophistry is a bad form of dialectics. That is how a dialectics is sometimes known. Lawyers who, make the innocent guilty and the guilty innocent and so on. It's trickiness. It's entirely subjective. It is to make a subjective point and tear down any objective norm and so on. That is sometimes called dialectics too. So nevertheless, that is not what he means. He goes now, he makes the attack now, after he has been friendly and nice, and that these human hands there, these shrines which were made by human hands, are useless in terms of the God who brings down, because he does not live in temples and so on. So he has gone slowly, but it is very nice and soft still. nor is he dependent on anything that human hands can do for him. There's sacrifices. This God does not need any sacrifice. He has everything what he needs, and so on. So and can do for him, and so on. So that is echoes, of course, the whole prophets. So Paul stands in the tradition of Isaiah and Jeremiah, and who would say these gods have eyes and they cannot see, they have legs and they cannot walk. You take a piece of wood and half of it you put in the fire, the other half you make a god out of it. So that goes up to marks of commodity fetishism, right? Capitalism is commodity fetishism. That stuff, the commodities, are the works of our hands, and then we stand before them and we admire them, and then the market even gets in control of ourselves and fires us in spite of the fact that we have all degrees and so on. So that is the whole Marxist thing. Marx was a Jew, baptized Lutheran. He also stands in that same tradition. That is when his children, asked him what the music was about in the church, as I mentioned, and he would say, there was once a poor man, and the rich people murdered him. And then he said to the bourgeoisie in London, and he would say that to the bourgeoisie in Kalamazoo too, why do you make a liar out of this man, who with every word you say and with every deed you do? And you have to apply that, for instance, to the discussions there. We discuss that a little bit later with the vice presidents. Both are Catholics, so how do they appear in the public sphere? So we have to connect it all with what we are doing here. So that means it is against idolatry. So he becomes critical now of the idolatry. What Marx's charge against capitalism is that it's idolatry. It is, capital is our own product, but we relate to it as if it was our master. We bow before it. It's the bottom line. We follow the bottom line. We make our laws and so on in favor of it. So, and Max Weber then repeated that. The civil society, bourgeois society, is polytheistic. Idolatry, the god is to whom you put most time and most energy. So if you have porno all the time, that would have been called Aphrodites. If you work for war and you pay billions for it, that would be called Mars, the god Mars. We don't have these names anymore, but we have the forces of idolatry. They are there. So Marx attacks the capitalist society as an idolatrous society. Paul does the same thing. It's the Decalogue. You have only one God, no other gods. That developed only slowly. So Abraham had this one God vision. His relatives made little gods. They were God makers. He is called to leave that country and so on. But it is not pure monotheism. It is henotheism, it's called. He still recognizes other gods. His wives still have kitchen gods, whom he thinks are real somehow. Only slowly the Jewish consciousness comes to the point that the other gods are not real at all, and then make fun of them. And that is a source, of course, of anti-Semitism, at least one cause. If you live between Egypt and the Euphrates and Tigris civilization, and they all have gods, and you say they have eyes and cannot see, and they have legs and cannot walk, and they have certain powers, they're just your own making, and so on, then they will hate you for that. They will hate your guts for it, and so on. So that is at least one of the reasons for which goes through all societies up to the present, where then Hitler was able, to stimulate this this type of anti-Semitism, because he reminded the people of the economic activities of Jews and turned it around and said the Jews are materialistic and the Jews have only money in their mind all the time, and so on and so on. And they have poisoned us. That is why we have become so rotten, because they got us into that with their banking business. They Rothschild, their Jewish high finance. They were responsible for 70 war and World War, and that is why they have to be annihilated. We have to get rid of the cancer, otherwise we cannot, the human species cannot survive. Okay, so you can always break in whenever you want to. So that is since he can never be in need of anything, the God, so he develops a new God concept now, which is different from the gods there, yes.
Well, some religious orders in the early medieval period conducted banking.
Yeah,
They
Right.
traded money
yeah,
and made profits.
right. Well, you know, we don't say that what the anti-Semites say that this is necessarily true. I mean, we know, you know, that the Jewish people did get into the money business very early, or into trade. So in the Middle Ages, productive people were appreciated. All merchants were looked down on because people did not know why a merchant makes money when he does not change the commodity which he has not produced.
Yeah, but you know, the Jews were not permitted also to own land at one time.
Right.
Throughout the Middle
They
Ages.
could not own land, they were put into the ghetto, they could not join the guilds, so the shoemaker guild or the baker guild and so on. They could not defend part of the wall there. The guilds had saints, they were all religious and so on. So therefore they were pushed out of production and they were pushed into circulation, as that's called. So that is concretely, the farmers came and brought their 10 little pigs there to the wall, to the door, and then the little Jew came and said, you know, okay, what does it cost, the little pig? 5 cents, you know, so I give you 10 cents or 5 cents for it, and then you can go to the inn and you can drink beer inside. Then he took the paid the 5 cents, took the pigs around the corner to the marketplace and sold them for 10 cents. And that is where then surplus value starts, where speculation starts. He took the surplus money then and gave it as a loan to the farmer for interest, and he could not take interest because of the usury laws. The Jews had usury laws, the Christians had usury laws, and the Muslims still have usury laws, so you cannot take interest, that's sinful, because if you give $100 and then you get $110 back, nobody knew where the $10 are coming from. You had not worked for the $10, somebody else had worked for it, and therefore you got it, that's robbery. So Catholics have brought it down to 2.5%. You can take interest or pay 2.5%. That is considered to be the costs for the work of the banks. So, but the irony is that the Jews were condemned for having started capitalism in spite of the fact, or not for working, first of all, not working and then become capitalists, in spite of the fact that the Christians had pushed them out of production into. So they were blamed for going into circulation, and it was the Christians who had pushed them out of production into circulation. So this in itself is a horrifying thing. And then, of course, you know, the St. Peter's Cathedral, where the Pope speaks from there, that was paid, you know, with money which was collected. Indulgence money was collected, and half of it went to Rome for building the cathedral there, and the other half went to Fugger and Welser. These were banking places in Bavaria, and they were not Jewish at all. And so banks in northern Italy and in Holland, they were not Jewish at all. So when Henry Ford, the fascist here, together with Father Coughlin there, when they claimed all of Wall Street, that was Jewish. All speculative capital was Jewish, in spite of the fact that there were innumerable Aryans there as well. So when it goes badly with capitalism, then they blame the Jews, then make them into scapegoats for capitalism not working. But that is why Henry Ford wrote the published the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, a little red book, you know, which is the most furious attack against the Jews who want to have world power, and that is why he published 4 volumes against the International Jew, in which he proved step by step in all kinds of little things in Michigan and elsewhere where the Jews do the same thing, cheating all the time and so on. So, and then the Jews boycotted the tea model, which didn't go very well along the East Coast, and they forced him to abandon his anti-Semitism. He was a neutralist, like Lindbergh. He didn't want to go in the war. He wanted the Germans to let them kill the communists over there and leave their back free. And the Roosevelt administration then changed the thing, and he was forced, you know, to change his car production into the Liberator production here in Detroit, of which I shot 16 down.
But Ford had chartered a boat, a peace boat at one time.
Right, yeah, right. Well, he tried everything. He took the decorations in Berlin. He went to Berlin, got decorations from Hitler and so on. He hate Hitler all the time. And what they bound him together was this anti-Semitism, but also a whole theory. They were both Keynesians, and they both wanted to get rid of Wall Street. And so Hitler was even better than Keynes. He improved on Keynes. He solved problems which Keynes hadn't even solved yet at that time. And he was able to give 6 million Germans, he said 7 million, let's say 6 million Germans, jobs. That's 10% of the population. And Stalin took off all the Wall Street things, so all the institutions, and he had no depression at all. So if Ford would live now here in Michigan, he would have given no support to Wall Street. He would have given all the support to productive capital, those who build roads and houses and cars and locomotives and so on, but nothing to speculative capital, because they don't produce anything, Wall Street. It does have a function. It has to invest money into industries so that they can produce and then build jobs. That's Romney's theory, right? That's the theory of the neoconservatives. So it was Reagan who gave up Keynesianism and replaced it by Friedman and the Chicago School. That means no policing anymore of the market, the deregulation and privatization and so on, and that led to the catastrophe of 2008, and that is what Romney wants to repeat again. That is the argument which the president should make all the time, because obviously people have forgotten what happened between Reagan and 2008. And to repeat that again, you can put it into the future then. What would happen 2 years after Romney would be in power, the economists would come again and would say to him what they said to President Bush. But Mr. President, the economy goes over the brink. And then he would have to do the same thing what Bush did. He nationalized the banks and the industries. And Obama did not even do that to the extreme as Bush did. But he will have to do it to the very extreme, because there will be no money coming from China anymore. The Chinese said that. We should read both books of Adam Smith. It's shameful that the communists have to tell us the books which we should read. One book is about the wealth of nations. That means how you get rich. The other one is a morality book, how to curb the greed which is the idolatry of capitalism. It's the greed, so which has no limits or whatever. So they have to be policed if the greed does not push them into suicide. And I've just heard from Wall Street that there were friends there, relatives there, and they said, we'll not vote for Obama. He will take everything away from us for which we work too hard. I said, when the hell have you ever worked hard? Because they don't work. That's not called work. That means they are in the circulation. They are not in production, and that was never called work, really. So, but I said, no, he will have progressive taxation, so they will be taxed higher, but he's not a socialist. He is a liberal, also a liberal. He will not take anything away from them, but he will also not rescue capitalism. No, they will Romney. If you were in Venezuela now, and with Chavez, who just won the election, he would like Romney. For every socialist, Romney would finish it up much faster than the Obama. Good. When you make reforms, you give a little bit more lifespan to capitalism. And therefore, whoever wants to have a little bit more capitalism, he should vote for Obama. The other one finish it up. Because one good example is George Soros, who pays my Eastern students there in Dubrovnik and in Yalta. He paid the election for Obama, but he wanted him to nationalize the banks and nationalize the industry. He, a super capitalist, a billionaire, because he knows that civil society destroys itself if it is not policed. And Obama did not fulfill that. Obama did nationalize the debts of the banks, but not the banks. So that will have to be done then, and like Bush, who was an extreme neoliberal, suddenly nationalized the banks. And Romney, an extreme neoliberal, he will have to nationalize the banks. And if he does what he said, namely to let it go, let the market decide that the banks who are too big to fail will be allowed to fail anyway, and that the car industry, which is too big to fail, will fail anyway, the unemployment will go up to 20%, and the cities will be in turmoil, and they will have to do what Roosevelt did not do and what everybody else did in Europe, namely to ask for the emergency laws, send the Congress home, and govern by edict. And you have a completely different country which will either go to fascism or it will go to socialism. Since the education is so low, it will go to fascism and not to socialism. We are not prepared for socialism, but we are prepared for fascism. And I told you my life story there, that when I was young, I saw the transition from liberalism to fascism, and then I was trained here to go back to bring the German fascism over into liberalism again. So we have these three forces. There's liberalism, and liberalism gets in trouble and hits the bottom because of this, like 2008 or 1929, then socialists appear. That's why they call Obama socialist or whatever. And when this danger of socialism comes, then fascist forces, because fascism is the means of the ruling class to get the socialists under control, push them out, and restore liberalism again. That is what happens, what will happen too. So that's what we now that liberals act like fascists to urinate on dead Talibans. That is fascism. To go out at night in Afghanistan and shoot 17 people, their women and children, that is fascism. To burn the Holy Quran, that is fascism. To use waterboarding like the Holy Inquisition and like the SS, so the CIA now, that's fascism. But that liberals do fascist things does not yet mean that they are fascists. More has to happen than that. They particularly have to become much more intelligent. If we had a guy who had an IQ like Hitler, that would be a real danger. So when the American people don't want to have a super guy in the White House who has a real brain or so, but rather an average guy, that's a good instinct. Because if you really had a smart guy there, heaven knows what he could do. He could do something good, but he could do also horrible things. So that as far as the diagnosis and the prognosis, and that is an important election now, which is coming up. So, but they have formed that new word, an under-informed electorate. That's a horrible word, but it's a new one. Under-informed, that means people are not educated, that they can remember what happened from Reagan to 2008 and why it happened. And that therefore one cannot repeat it again. And that those who cannot remember will have to repeat it again. Now the numbers of Romney are too high if one thinks of this, even if he will lose or whatever. At the moment they are, that so many people cannot remember anything, that is most catastrophic as far as the present situation of the electorate is concerned. I mean, it just happened. Millions of people just lost their homes. Millions of people lost their jobs and so on. So why can't they remember what just had happened to them? Why they cannot connect the dots? That is a nice expression, to connect the dots. They cannot connect the dots because it needs certain categories like surplus value, which have been repressed, which people are not taught, and so they are unable to connect the dots, and that is why it is part of why Romney can have those numbers. They are ununderstandable how these statistics can be that way, you know. I mean, if he would be 10 points below, that would already be catastrophic, you know, but sometimes he is even with him in numbers, and sometimes Romney is, because of that discussion, he is even a few points higher than the president. And I mean, that indicates, you know, where the consciousness of people is and what they can remember and what they can't remember anymore. Okay, let me go back to this text and to finish it up there. So it is the attack against idolatry, right? Idolatry is that means to make images of the absolute, finite images which are untrue, and also not to name the divinity in the radical sense. Because all language is finite, God is infinite. Whenever you use finite language to speak about God, that is insufficient, that is untrue. It is every name of God is blasphemy in a certain sense, because finite language never reaches the infinite. And so the prohibition of making images of the absolute or naming it is the prohibition against idolatry. And Marx's attack against capitalism is that it is idolatry. He is, Marx was not a cataphatic believer in the cataphatic tradition, where you have a revelation, and he rejected that, and therefore he's called an atheist. But he stands in the apophatic tradition, in which God is about that. When you feel any emotional dissonances or cognitive dissonances, then you have to speak up.
When you talk about the under-informed electorate, I think
Yeah, that's a new
many,
word.
many people would agree with that.
Right.
It seems that it would be also true that we have an under-informed political class as well, unless the political class is just talking to the electorate in terms that they think the electorate will respond to, rather than upping the conversation to the real issues. I mean,
Yeah.
you talked and gave the example of how President Reagan cast rules and regulations
Yeah.
to the side, and a lot of evidence that that didn't work out quite so well. But
Right.
more currently, just within the last 4 or 5 years, there's been any number of examples where so-called trickle-down economics has not worked terribly well
Right.
either, and yet not only do you not hear the electorate by and large talking about that failure, I don't really see that the political leadership is challenging the electorate to think about those kinds of
No.
messages themselves. Are they all in it together?
Well, I think it is a cultural thing, you know. One would have to reflect, you know, what has happened, because all the way we are now, you know, has not come out suddenly or whatever. It has developed over a long time, and we had, if you take the first Roosevelt thing, you know, the rebellion on Manhattan, the lower Manhattan marching against the upper Manhattan, the people in the tenement houses, stinking houses, you know, with disease, and burned down all the landlords' houses up there, and then Theodore Roosevelt, you know, put it all down. But he also had suggestions, you know. The federal government has to intervene into the market, and we need universal health insurance. Behind that is already the experience of 100 years of depression every 12 years.
Mhm.
And during these depressions, people starved to death, you know, and then labor was too expensive afterwards. So in London and elsewhere, they started social legislation so that people would survive the depressions, and then they would have sufficient labor force and also sufficient military for the colonies. You know, all capitalistic countries need colonies. Central America, South America, and the Philippines are our colonies. India were a British colony, and Africa was divided up between the British and the French and the Germans and so on. And so Hitler wanted to have Russia for his colony, for his capitalistic masters, you know. So all capitalistic countries need cheaper and cheaper labor, cheaper and cheaper resources. And therefore, you know, the political people, they should enlighten people and should not tell them, we will not outsource. You know, if Obama promises that, they are not liars. See, that's what I want to say. They are not liars. They may wish to do that, and they make this promise, but it's not possible to do that. Why? Because it is not enough that Ford Motor Company makes the same profit. The profit has to be increased. Here the labor unions in Flint by the cities tried, then won. And as they won, they produced that what is called the middle class. The middle class is not the middle class, it's the working class, well-earning working class. That's what we did here and what the labor unions did in Michigan. That is what is threatened now. But why, you see? Because the labor unions were so effective, the wages went up. And the higher the wages go, the lower is the surplus value. So therefore, at a certain point, the car industry went to Mississippi, and then they went to Central America, and then they went to India, and then they went to China, and so on. See, that if you want to have that system as it is, and both parties are capitalistic parties, both parties are liberal parties, both parties are bourgeois parties, so they have an affirmative attitude to the capitalist system. Under the precondition that we have this capitalistic system, you have to go where the cheaper labor is. That's why they have to outsource. If you don't want to do that, then you have to lower the wages here. So Kellogg, for instance, pays 75 cents in El Salvador or in South Africa. That is such a low wage level that the surplus value is enormous. With that surplus value, they can keep the salaries of the workers in Battle Creek relatively high, so that these workers have a car and they have a house, more than their grandfather had, and they can send their son to Western Michigan University in order to get into middle management and so on. And then they are satisfied. And it does not matter to them if the abyss between them and the Kellogg's and their houses and their cars and their vacations and their educational possibilities and so on is deepening, because they are relatively satisfied where they are. Right? So, but if you want to change that and you don't want to outsource anymore and get these cheaper labor in Africa or in India or whatever, then you would have to lower the income here. You would have to make it into a low labor country where the Germans and the Japanese would come over here because the labor here would be cheaper than anywhere else. But you would lower the living standard by 50 or 60 or 1%. And I think the American working class, 200 million people, will not take this.
I can understand that from a purely economic standpoint, but you look to other voices who would say, we have poll after poll that says that the country, and that's, you know, by nature includes everyone. Most people are saying this is not the same country. We're heading in the wrong direction. It sort of sounds like the people are willing to accept something a little bit less in terms of stuff if there was a better direction insofar as values or things that have lasting merit, without trying to sound religious about it. The people seem to be saying there has to be more out there than just more stuff, and that's why we're dissatisfied with the way that the country is going. But we as a country don't respond very well to
that. But the people who say, you know, it goes in the wrong direction, that's the Romney people. They say, what we saw in the last 4 years, that goes in the wrong direction. And what they mean is, you know, more regulation, or, you know, like that means the return to what was there before Reagan. That means to police the ruling class more. That is the wrong direction, which they mean. They don't think that Romney, I mean, as far as the advertisements are concerned, it always comes from the Romney side that we are going in the wrong direction. And he says the people say they're going the wrong direction.
I guess I was remembering some type of poll examples that seem to suggest that upwards of 60% of the people in the country felt that the country was going in the wrong direction,
right,
whatever that means. That percentage was so large that it struck me that it had to include more people than just the Romneyites, if you will.
Well, I think, no, we can be sure that wrong direction means that we went in the wrong direction the last 4 years, and if we have another 4 years like that, then we go even further in the wrong direction, and that Romney will get us in the right direction. And that means the Reagan direction, that means the Bush direction. I think, and the question is about the content of direction, you know?
Right.
Because the bourgeoisie is always formalistic. They have principles, and then they don't particularize it. So both of them shout at each other and say, specifics, specifics, specifics. Because they know when they give specifics that it's dangerous. If you remain, you know, with universals, which you don't particularize, then you are safe. As a matter of fact, Romney is so childlike sometimes, he says that even. He says, if I give specifics, they will all attack me. Recently he said, the rich are fine, he said, you know, no matter who gets into power, the rich are fine. That means we have a frozen system of two bourgeois parties which cannot move right or left. And therefore, whatever they pay both parties, and therefore whatever party comes in, the rich will be fine. And he says it in bright daylight, you know. I mean, this is amazing, the naivete of this, whatever you call the political class or whatever. Yes?
Could I inject a thought here? I think we are becoming informed, and I think the electorate is composed of more than party thinking. And I think that 60% that you suggest is out there contains maybe a reaction to, let's say, Monsanto's GMO 94% of the market. They control the patents of the seeds. We're looking at the results of Jeffrey Smith's work coming out with Genetic Roulette, now a video, DVD that hit the market 6 weeks ago. I think the reaction is going to be powerful from the people who are becoming to get in the know, because we get sick from the policies that we go, the genetic modification. I mean, it's just unbelievable what we are learning through functional medicine. But what do we have? The money goes into the med schools from the chemical companies, from the Pfizers, from the, sorry to name drop, but just places that make money out of sick people.
Right.
Instead of looking at cause, which now we have to do because we can't heal with drugs anymore. We've reached the limit on some of the diseases. We have to look at what we are doing to ourselves to create that situation.
Yeah.
And I think Adam Smith with his moral code, how to curb the greed. Well, if George Soros says capitalism destroys itself unless it's policed, how about moral code as a policing system?
Yeah,
Didn't
right.
we used to have a moral code?
Yeah.
Weren't we more functional as a country when that existed? And didn't that moral code?
Yeah, if the 60%, mean that, that they want to have another direction or whatever.
Well, I've
that
never
could be meant,
read a definition as to who those people are. I'm just thinking to myself that a lot of those people have to be feeling some of the same sense of angst on a variety of different topics that we might be
If
feeling
that would be
ourselves.
the case, then we wouldn't have to be afraid for Obama, But, I mean, if that includes those people who worry about the chemical industry and, our thing, then, but I think that these people who say this, at least, Romney and somebody says we went in the wrong direction for 4 years and now it's time, and Paul Ryan, too. And he means the new regulations, government intervention into business and so on, instead of letting business do its thing and so on. That is what the wrong direction is, and they think that we had once the right direction. Whenever that was, they may think of the 50s or so, the war, of course, destroyed the whole competition in Germany and Japan, so there was a good time after the war. There were a lot of needs which had not been fulfilled, and they had to be fulfilled, so it was a very strong economy. So it is not entirely clear what he thinks when we had the right direction and when we started to do the wrong direction. One could start with the second Roosevelt, that this started the wrong direction when we thought about solidarity, but subsidiarity, which was taken from the social encyclical letter of Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years after the first one, 1891. Reo Novarum, new things. So 50 years after Marx, then the church suddenly saw that there was something wrong with capitalism, and then they wrote all these encyclical letters, about how to repair social capitalism, how to make it human. And that is called solidarism. That is what the popes have in their encyclicals since that time. And recently Paul Ryan went to Georgetown University, and they told him, that his budget plan has nothing to do with Jesus of Nazareth. It had something to do with Ayn Rand, who is that novelist from the Soviet Union who said greed is good, selfishness is good, and so on. So the Jesuits rejected that on the basis of the social encyclical letters. And the fellow here, the priest here, also made an edition. We mentioned him there. What was his name?
Ooh.
The fellow who went to Grand Rapids there.
Yeah, Father Sirico. Father Sirico?
Sirico, yeah. He made an edition of the encyclical letters, but he interpreted them completely in terms of neoconservatism and neoliberalism. So, so the Jesuits who produce those encyclicals, they really write them. So it's not the popes who write them. That this fellow there, Paul Ryan, or so, and his budget, that is far out. The solidarity or the solidarity movement, or solidarism, wants to be between liberalism and socialism. So from liberalism, they still take the idea of private property. They do not deny private property. But on the other hand, they want to have labor unions, and they want to have just wages and so on and so on. So it's between the two sides, this Catholic solidarism. So, we don't know exactly where these 60% come from, but it's possible, you know, that when they want to have a new direction, that they think the corporation and the health industry and so on, that we have enough of that and we need a new direction. But that is what Obama would say. So they could be in the Obama camp. Now, if they think, you know, we have to go back to, we would have to go back beyond the first Roosevelt, Theodore, you know, in order to say where it started to go wrong. What they mean was going wrong is a modification of individualism and of an atomistic liberalism. When they say, you know, I think Romney said that we shouldn't have helped the car industry. We should have left it to the market, you know. Well, so all these banks who are too big to fail, he would have let them fail. I mean, that is the pure liberalism of the 19th century, you know. That is the judgment of the market. But since the first Roosevelt, you know, one has seen that one cannot leave everything to the market. See, if you think of civil society, it has a need system, administration of justice, and the police. It has to be policed all the time, see. So on one side we say you can fulfill all your need, you can do whatever you want to. But that's not really true. We have more people in our prisons than any other country, see. Finally, you can fulfill your needs, but you are not allowed to frustrate other people or violate other people's right to fulfill their needs and so on. So, but there is this need, and the need system, that should be the basis, you know. One cannot judge the civil society of how many billionaires we have. It has to be judged if the majority of all people have enough to eat, to drink, to clothe, housing, education, and health insurance. These are the fundamental needs of people. And if you have 40 million people no health insurance, even after Obama, we will still have 20 million people who are not covered by health insurance. I mean, it's, you know, if it works, I mean, even then. And Roosevelt, 1909 started that. That's over 100 years, you know. And still, I mean, if you think underinformed now, you know, that's an old problem, which has grown for a long time, you know. I mean, the Germans had this health insurance by 1870. That was 30 years before Roosevelt. And it was a conservative statesman, Roosevelt, who did what was his name?
Bismarck?
Bismarck, who did it in order to take the wind out of the sails of the socialists. But, you know, and it worked beautifully. I never...
Well, it's fascinating to hear the criticism of, you know, all things government, and let's just talk specifically about the Medicare program when it has its fits and starts. Let's face it, it's a huge bureaucracy, but all things considered, it seems to me, from everything that I've been exposed to, that the vast majority of people in this country are pretty pleased with the fact that there's a Medicare system.
Yeah,
So isn't that precisely the reason why they want to privatize it? Because it functions well, and therefore it would make a lot of profit if it's privatized.
Has the potential, but then of course if you privatize it, then all of a sudden it becomes less than something that is a guarantee by virtue of being a citizen of the country.
So, so we don't know exactly, right? When people say new direction or that's the wrong direction, we wouldn't know what the content is. And we talk very much formalistic all the time. And that is an old bourgeois trick to do that, to make everything formalistic, because when you bring content in, it becomes revolutionary suddenly. And therefore, in order to remain nicely conservative, you have only the forms, you know, freedom and so on, but you don't particularize it. Justice, you don't particularize anything, and then you can fill it with whatever you want to, you know. Right. So it is with this idea of freedom, you know, it means the freedom of all, and the people use that. It's a Christian idea that all people should be free, and they use it in order to legitimate the freedom of the few all the time. That means they take that Christian thing there and make it into an ideology understood as false consciousness and as a masking of class interests and of national interests. And so it is this type of thing which it goes, and this is not this or that man now. I mean, it has happened in our culture, you know.
Well, trying to connect what we've just talked about with bringing the message to the public sphere. Is it the matter of the separation of church and state that prevents church officials, Catholic church officials, from standing up on the pulpit and saying something more about an upcoming election, like this one, for example, than simply telling the congregation to be fully informed of the issues and to understand the Catholic perspective? Why don't they take the next step and actually put a name or a party or something more specific on that suggestion?
Right.
Because they would then
So-
violate the separation of church and state,
Right.
and we get into the whole business of
I
challenging
mean,
the
if they would
tax
take,
exempt status.
if they would take the social encyclical letters, which are really from the Stoics there, whom Paul met there, they baptized the Stoic natural law in the Catholic Church, and these encyclical letters are built on that natural law position. Now, they could preach that in the churches. When I came to Baltimore and I taught for the Jesuits, they told me I would lose all my friends if I would do this. So it is a secret somehow kept in the Catholic community in this country here that these social encyclical letters really exist. When the Catholics were poor, they couldn't read them. After they went up to the middle class, like the Kennedys and so on, they didn't want to read them anymore because suddenly, these encyclical letters are for justice, and they have
Fair
made
play.
it now. They have made it now. They're the winners, and the winners don't want to hear about justice, and so therefore they didn't talk. But they could, in church circles, they would be free and would not violate any church state if they would teach it there. The question is, when they go out of this sphere, they cannot take one party thing because they are tax exempt. And if they would take one, although they would violate that, they could take the tax exemption away from these churches if the churches would take this sides, on the pulpit. And I think also people would resent that in the church if somebody on the pulpit would suddenly have a Democratic or Republican platform there.
I went to Mass in Troy a week ago, and the priest, Troy over by Detroit, and the priest did say during his homily, you have to vote for the party that upholds marriage between man and woman. You have to vote for the party that upholds the right to life. So he was saying you have to vote Republican, but he didn't say the word Republican.
Correct.
Yeah.
And a woman stood up to start to argue with him about telling people who to vote for in church.
See? Yeah.
And then I was just like, then some people started to clap for her. And I was just stunned. I didn't know, well, the priest said that she'd have to leave. That this isn't the place for that. You have to leave. And I don't know. I just thought, well, if it's not the place for it, why did you bring it up so specifically?
Yeah, right. So, right.
It was
So,
like you
I-
said. What reaction are people going to have?
I think what you
They're not
heard
gonna
is
like it.
akin to what I've heard from time to time over the years from the pulpit at the Catholic Church
Right.
here in town. But again, I'm just trying to connect it to this whole idea of bringing that system of values to the public sphere, and then obviously the church, just like other institutions, runs smack up against civil law and
Yeah.
what have you in a given society, and so it's like they can make suggestions, they can make recommendations, but it's almost like they're using code language, just like
Right.
you described.
Yeah, not very much hidden after all. But I mean, they would split the community in itself, and if they would do that. But they also would risk their tax exemption if they would do that. So we should make clear, what the public sphere is. In the church, that is really private space there. Public sphere would mean that somebody like Biden, is a Catholic, and Paul Biden there is also a Catholic, and they have this discussion there, and we can take that as our contemporary issue. They both confessed that they were Catholic, so they could be taken as two Catholics getting into the public sphere, and both of them said they were for the embryo. The soul gets into the embryo right at the moment of conception or so. Both, and Ryan said, I'm for faith, but also for intellect and science. Now, that the soul is in the embryo from the moment of conception is not a matter of science. I don't know any scientist who could prove this. So I don't know why he said that, but nevertheless, that would be a case now. So they are not in the church, they're preaching or whatever. They're outside now, television, for this is the public sphere. Mm-hmm. And so Biden said that he believed that, that the embryo is human, a person, from the very beginning, but that he did not want to impose that on the rest of society, which is a fair liberal position,
Mm-hmm.
So I believe it myself. But so he goes in the public sphere and he says, I believe this, but it's useless for you. It's a strange type of a position, but I mean, it fits both sides, Nobody can say you don't believe it. He believes it. The church will not be satisfied with it. That doesn't help him there. But otherwise, it is a good. And the other one, he says, I believe it, and then he is pro-life. So that is more consequential, but he may lose votes then for that, right? Because when the public has gone to, at least 2/3 have gone through the Freudian Enlightenment. So their attitude towards sexual matters, all of them, family matters, has changed. So when we had the president's, Clinton's blowjob, 2/3 did not want to have him impeached, but 1/3, and the Republican Party took that up, they wanted him, to be impeached. And so, therefore, if somebody says pro-life, he may risk something, but he was willing to risk that. So in a certain sense, he was more consequential, in his position.
So a public forum example might be when the Cardinals, for example, challenged the Obama administration in the implementation of this Affordable Health Care
Right, yeah.
Act, specifically as it relates to.
Right. So they are the beliefs of this group, and then he goes to court. Mm-hmm. That would go into the public sphere, right? The courts belong to civil society, but that is close to the public sphere. And so, that is a good example of it, right? So, and then how does one do it otherwise? And I think that both sides have to go through that process of argumentation. The church cannot simply say dogmatically or in an authoritarian way. I mean, they can do that in the community, but when they go into the public sphere, if they are dogmatic or authoritarian, they will lose it right away. So therefore, whatever they say, it has to be part of a process of argumentation so that a modern fellow, and the majority of modern people in the public sphere, can find this plausible and acceptable, so that it could also be transformed into a bill and introduced into the legislative process and could gain majority acceptance. That is the